In this first lesson, I'm going to introduce the basic technique for making automatically updating patterns in Illustrator CS5 and CS4. And this is the technique in its simplest form. I learned the basics from a tutorial by the most awesome Adobe expert, Deke McClelland, in his tutorial that's called Designing a Magically Updating Pattern. And here's how it works. I have an artboard here that's 6 by 6 inches square, and in the upper left corner is a flower, a single repeating unit for this pattern. The first step is to apply an effect, the transform effect. And we want to do that not just to this object, this flower, but we want to apply this effect to the entire layer that it lives on, and you'll understand why soon. But first, to apply an effect to a layer, we need to first target the layer by going over to the Layers panel and clicking on the round target icon. And you can see that selects all the art on the layer, but it also allows you to apply an effect to this layer that will then apply to any future art you draw on this layer. So now that the layer is targeted, we could go right on up to the Effect menu and choose an effect here. But for those of you who've taken my classes before, you know I like to use the Appearance panel for this because it offers more control and more editability. So notice in the Appearance panel, when I have the layer targeted, this top identifier reads Layer and not Path or Group as it often does. So we know we're about to apply an effect to the whole layer. Now I'll click the FX button at the bottom of the panel and choose Distort and Transform, and then Transform. Now if you've taken my Illustrator Essentials classes, we've talked about the command Transform Each, which is a really cool command that you can find in the Object menu under Transform. And the panel over here in the Appearance panel looks exactly the same as Transform Each. Same options, but in this case we're talking about a live effect, and here it's called Transform Effect. And when you have a live effect like this, it means you can always go back and edit it, change the measurements, or turn it off and on in the Appearance panel. And that's because it's live, it's changeable. And when we apply Transform as an effect to a whole layer, well, it does something automatically to whatever you create on this layer. And that's why I call this class Automatic Patterns. So in the Transform Effect dialog box, I'll go down to the bottom and check Preview so we can preview the effect on the artboard. Then I'll go to Move Horizontal and type 1 inch into the horizontal box. And then type the number 5 into the Copies field, hit Tab to see the preview, and so what this transform effect is doing is copying this first unit 5 times to fill the rest of this 6-inch wide square, just moving the copies 1 inch at a time in the horizontal direction, and we're moving toward the right since we're using a positive number, 1 inch. These copies would occur on the left side if we chose negative 1 inch. So I'll hit OK to accept that. And since this is a live effect occurring on this layer, these copies are not actual paths. So in outline mode, and that's Command or Control Y, you'll only see the original unit of the art. The rest of the art is created by the transform effect. Now I can draw on this layer. First, I want to make sure I'm no longer targeting the layer, so I can just click the artboard and that releases the target. Now, anything else I draw on this layer will repeat 5 times 1 inch apart in this direction. And I can move it and it updates. And just to say this again, the art in the upper left corner is really the only vector paths on the artboard. The copies are just an effect. Okay, so I'll select and delete the extra here. All right. Now we'll apply another effect so we can see the unit of art travel vertically, and that will fill the rest of this 6 by 6 inch field. First, I'll go to the Layers panel, and notice the target icon is now filled in with a gradient. So that's just showing us that this layer now has a complex appearance applied to it. And again, I want to click the target so the double ring appears, so I can add another effect to this layer, and then I'll go up to the Appearance panel. And here I can see the first transform effect that we added to the layer. And now just go down to the FX button again and choose Distort and Transform and then transform. And you'll see a warning box this time, and it says you're applying another instance of this effect. And yes, that's what we intend to do, so hit Apply New Effect. And now in the dialog box, check Preview, and then we're going to enter into the Move Vertical field this time. Just 1 inch, and then 5 copies again, since this is a 6 by 6 inch pattern field, and then hit the Tab key to preview and hit OK to add the effect. Now we have our little 1 inch flower art repeating across the whole field in both directions. And again, in outline mode, you can see the only art we really have on this layer is the original unit. Everything else is created by the transform effect. And if you need to make changes to either of these effects, just go back to the Appearance panel, and you can click on the blue links to see the panel again, check Preview, and then you can change the measurements or the number of copies. But I like what I had, and I don't want to change it, so I'm going to cancel this. And I'll just click off to the side here. So now the layer is no longer targeted, so that way I know I won't accidentally make changes to the layer as it's all set up now. And then I can just add to the design. I can change a color, and the changes update across the field. It's pretty amazing, the idea that you can preview repeating patterns in Illustrator versions earlier than CS6 without going through the process of dragging art into the swatches panel to create repeat pattern swatches. And so anything I do on this layer will repeat like this because of those transform effects on this layer. But there's one thing you need to make sure of, and that's to go into your preferences, that's Command or Control K. And here we have Scale, Strokes, and Effects. And since we're using effects in this file, and we're hitting the target on the layer a lot, we definitely want this option turned off, unchecked. And that way you won't accidentally scale those transform effects that we've set up. So this is a great way to work on a design and get the spacing of your elements just right and really see how it repeats instantly. And when you're done editing, you can export this artboard just as it is, as a PNG or a JPEG, and you can use it as a background paper, and you can move it into Photoshop and work on it there. So now you know the basic technique, and in the following lessons, I'll take this to the next level, particularly for those who design patterns for fabric or for paper crafting. So I'm going to be demonstrating with more complex patterns, including a half drop repeat, and I've included some layered template files in the downloads, and those add even more functionality to this technique, so you can be ready to export your designs for printing on fabric at Spoonflower or for using your designs as digital background papers. In the next lessons, I'll demonstrate how I set up my pattern templates so you'll know how to edit them and create your own set of template files. And then you're ready to draw, design, and edit your patterns before exporting your art for Spoonflower or for Photoshop. And I'll take you through those steps as well. So download the exercise files and meet me in the next lesson. In this lesson, go and open up the exercise file I've included in the downloads called LC Auto Pattern _ Basic 3" for your version of Illustrator, and that's an AIT file. It's a template file, meaning that when you open it, its name becomes Untitled, so you can rename it whatever you like, and essentially from there on you're working on a copy of the original, so you won't have to worry about writing over the original AIT file, and that way you can use it again and again. This template file is similar to what I demonstrated in the first lesson. It's a basic repeat, and I'm just moving it around a bit here. And as you can see, there's new artwork in this file for you to play with. And this is a good way for you to get familiar with working inside this file without having to create a design from scratch. And then later on, you can delete this art and add your own designs. I've added a number of layers to this file, and this file is using 3 artboards. And so we're taking advantage of the multiple artboards feature, and this will make it easier to export an image file of the repeat unit for upload to Spoonflower, or you can export a 12 by 12 inch background paper in JPEG format, and you'll be able to print out tests of the whole pattern field or just a single unit of the repeat on your home printer, and that's all from this one file. So in this lesson, I'm going to start you off with a demonstration of how I set this up. Here's a look at the New Document dialog box that pops up whenever you create a new document. This template is for a basic repeat or a grid style repeat, so that's why I named this file Basic, and later we'll do a half drop repeat. Also, I used 3 inches in the name of the template file because that's the size of the repeating unit of this pattern. And later you could have a collection of templates for different sized repeats, and this will just help you tell them apart on your hard drive. I started this file with 1 artboard, and although we'll create a total of 3 artboards in this file, we're going to only specify 1 in this first step. This artboard is the size of the repeating unit. It's 3 by 3 inches. And later when you create your own template files, you can make this any size you want. And it doesn't have to be square, it can be rectangular too. The unit of measurement for this file is set to inches. Under Advanced Options, the color mode is RGB, and raster effect settings are at 150 dpi, and that's just in case we decide to use any drop shadows or other pixel-based effects later. And 150 dpi is the default resolution that Spoonflower uses. You can always change this later if you're using a different print process, like for example if you want 300 dpi print resolution to export JPEG background papers. So you can change this later if you need to, and that's in the Effect menu under Document Raster Effect Settings. Okay, now back to the template file. So in the template file here with all the art hidden, you can see the original 3 by 3 inch artboard in the top corner. This is the area where we'll draw and edit the repeat unit, like I demonstrated with the flower in the last lesson. The unit next to it is also 3 by 3 inches, and this is the unit we will export or print from, and this will be more obvious later why, but you can see that because it's fully inside the larger pattern field artboard, it has a border where there will be pattern all the way around this little artboard, and that won't always be the case with the working unit artboard up here in the corner. And you can only have multiple artboards like this in CS4 and later versions of Illustrator, because that's when the feature was introduced. So I'll jump over to another file and show you how I created these artboards. Here I have just my 3 by 3 inch artboard, and I'll go down to the Artboard tool in the Tool panel and click on it, and that brings us into Artboard editing mode. And then up here in the control bar, I'm going to change the name of this artboard to Working Unit, and that's just to keep things organized, and I'm in CS5 here. For CS4 users, you won't be able to name your artboards, but just know that this is artboard number 1. Next, I'll turn on Smart Guides. That's Command or Control U, and that way I can make sure to line things up precisely. Since we're working on a pattern after all, it has to be exactly right. So my 3 by 3 inch artboard is selected. I'll hold down the Option or Alt key and click and drag out a copy. And here I'm aligning it with the Smart Guides exactly on this corner here. And so now I'll name this new artboard Export Unit, and that will be Artboard 2 in CS4. So this is the artboard that we'll export for Spoonflower. And then, just to make sure that I move that into place exactly, I'm going to check my X and Y coordinates for that artboard, because patterns really demand that you get all your measurements exact. And unfortunately the X and Y will be different depending on whether you're in version CS5 or version CS4. So I'm going to show you on screen the X and Y coordinates for Artboard 1 and Artboard 2. So if you're following along, you can pause here and select each artboard and check these coordinates in your file. Now I'll create the third artboard, the big artboard, for the field where the pattern repeats. I'm going to move out here outside the other 2 artboards and click and drag holding down Shift to create a large square. It's selected, and now I'll go up to the control bar and type in my dimensions to get this precisely right. And this artboard is 12 by 12 inches square. And now I'll move it into place, And the smart guides will let me know when it's exactly aligned with the top left corner of the first artboard. And it's a good idea to double check our positioning again. So here are the X and Y coordinates for this artboard for CS5 and CS4. Now I'll name this artboard Field, or if you're working in CS4, this is automatically named Artboard 3. And finally, in CS5, there's an Artboards panel. CS4 doesn't have this panel, but in CS5 we can see our 3 artboards listed here: the working unit, the export unit, and the field. Meet me in the next lesson and we'll take a tour of the layers in this file and see how they function. We're back with the finished template, and we're going to take a look at the layers in this file now. At the bottom we have the background color layer. This has a 12 by 12 inch square on it, and it's aligned to Artboard 3, the field artboard. Keeping the background on a separate layer allows us to preview the pattern field against a solid color and change it easily or turn it off and on, so it's more versatile this way, but it also helps us avoid one of the limitations of this repeating effect, and I'll demonstrate that here in another window. Here we're looking back at the pattern unit we used in the first lesson, but this time I've added a background color square. And this is how you often work in Illustrator when you're making pattern fill swatches. And we explore pattern swatches a lot in my Illustrator 2 class, but in this class we're creating repeats in a totally different way. So now over in the Appearance panel, I'll turn on the eyeball so we can see the transform effects at work. And now that we have that yellow square repeating, we see a solid color background. And next, let's say I want to add a polka dot like this. Well, if I move the polka dot so that it crosses the top or the left boundary of the artboard, you can see the repeating polka dot gets cut off. And it looks like that has to do with the way the background square, that solid yellow square, is repeating. It laps like fish scales or roof shingles from this top left corner of the artboard. So in the repeat, the background square is actually overlapping the polka dot. So to avoid things getting cut off in the design, we need to have the background color on another layer instead of making a tiled background like we have here. So back to our exercise file. Here's the background layer. You can change this color. You can leave this layer locked while you're editing the pattern elements above, and that way you won't accidentally select the background. And you can turn its visibility off and on, of course. So that's the background layer. The next layer up is the auto repeat layer, and this layer has the transform effects applied to it already. So any art you add to this layer will repeat, as we saw in the first lesson. To look at these effects, first target the auto repeat layer, and then we can go up to the Appearance panel. And there are 2 transform effects here, just like in lesson 1, and I'll click the link for the first transform effect, and here the options are set to move horizontally by 3 inches, so that's the width of the repeating unit, and I've set it to 4 copies to fill out the pattern field in this direction. Okay, and to look at the next instance, I'll click the link, and we're moving vertically this time by 3 inches, so that's the height of the repeating unit. And if you're in CS4, this number here will actually be -3 inches. And that's because the ruler origin changed starting in CS5, and I think it makes more sense in CS5, but I talk more about this in my Illustrator Essentials classes. So without going into detail here, just know, CS4 users, that your measurements will be a little different here and there, and I will point that out as we go. Okay, and it takes 4 copies to fill out the 12 by 12 inch pattern field in this direction, so this is a very basic square repeat. And we'll be looking at a half drop repeat later. Okay, so now I'll collapse the Appearance panel and we can focus on the art. And remember, you'll see in outline mode the only paths on this layer are in the top left corner. And I'm going to go ahead and delete all this art here to help me demonstrate how the next layer works. This layer is called Scratch Pad. It contains the design elements that we'll be using on the pattern, and it's a place where you can keep any preliminary work that you don't want to show previewing and repeat. There are no effects applied to this layer. And when you're not using it, you can turn its visibility off and you can lock it to leave your work there undisturbed. So I'll go ahead and select the group of elements on this scratch pad layer, and then back in the Layers panel, here's the selected art indicator, this red square. And now to make a copy of the selected art while moving it down to the repeat layer, I'll hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC and drag the art indicator down to the auto repeat layer. Just drag that red square. So in the Layers panel, Option-Alt dragging copies the selected elements to another layer as you drag, and the copy is positioned in the exact same place as the original, just on another layer. And so now the copy of the elements is on the auto repeat layer, but I need to move these down so the design starts on Artboard 1, the working unit artboard. And checking this in outline mode, it's right where it needs to be. Okay. So if I turn off visibility on the auto repeat layer, you can see the original art is still there on the scratch pad layer. And to avoid confusion, I'm going to lock and turn off the scratch pad layer since we're done with this for now, and I'll turn the auto repeat layer back on. Okay, and now I can ungroup this design and move the individual elements around or add new elements, and you can see the whole pattern field updates. And even when an element crosses the bounds of the repeating unit on the top or the left side, you can see a preview of the same shape crossing the boundary on the opposite side. So nothing's getting cut off and everything seems to be working well. Next, going back to the Layers panel, we'll look at these two layers at the top here, and these are here to assist you in the editing process while you're working on your pattern. Here I have a Unit Guides layer. I'm going to turn off the background layer for a minute so it's easier to see our artboards. And, you know, as you're working on your pattern, after a while, you may get tired of seeing these outlines of the artboards interrupting your design. And it's nice to turn them off and on. And you can turn artboard visibility off and on. The command is up in the View menu. It's View, Hide Artboards. And if you memorize the shortcut, it's not too bad. It's like the Hide Edges command with Shift added. So that's Command or Control Shift H. And this is a toggling command, so you can show and hide the artboard with the same keyboard shortcut. So that's one way to get those artboard boundaries out of your way. Okay, and I'll go ahead and turn my background layer back on. But here's the way I like to work. In this file, I want to leave the artboard visibility turned off. And I want to use the Layers panel and Guides to do this. I just like the way this works better. You can click the eyeball to turn these guides off and on when you need a reminder of the boundaries of your repeat unit, and you can change the color of the guide so you can make it work with your design, and that way it'll be as visible as possible. And I think the red really shows up against this blue design, but if I was working on a red design, I'd want to change that. So to create this, I made a 3-inch square on the guide layer. I aligned it to the working unit artboard, Artboard 1, and it's easiest just to make sure the artboard that you want to align to is selected by clicking on it, or if there's artwork on it and you select it, that will make it the active artboard. And you can always tell which artboard is the active one because its outline is a little darker than the others. Then up on the control bar, I want to make sure that my alignment mode is set to Align to Artboard, and then I can use these icons to get my shape aligned perfectly to the active artboard. And then with the square selected, just go up to the View menu and choose Guides, Make Guides. And this command turns the square or any shape you create into a guide. And if you want to change the guide color, cyan is the default, you can change the color in Preferences. That's Command or Control K, and then go to Guides and Grid. And here's where I changed my guide color to red. And this makes a global change to all the guides in your file. Okay, and I like to keep the guides layer locked. And then finally, the top layer is called Field Mask. And I'll go ahead and turn this layer on so we can see how it works. It just covers up the edges of the design so you can see what it looks like when the pattern is trimmed. Now, this isn't actually a mask in Illustrator terms. This is not a clipping mask. This is like using a mat in framing, and it covers the extra edges of the design. And I'll turn off visibility on all the other layers and select the mask so you can see this. So it's just a square filled with white, and it's large enough to cover the design and anything that falls outside of that 12 by 12 inch artboard. And then in the center, there's a hole cut out that's a 12 by 12 inch square, and that hole is aligned to the field artboard. And you can cut a window out of a shape with the Pathfinder or the Shape Builder tool, which is pretty basic, so I won't go through those steps here. Okay, so I'll turn on the background and the auto repeat layer, and you can see how the mask layer helps clean things up. And if I turn on the scratch pad layer so that you can see this, I want to keep my scratch pad art outside of the mask up here so it doesn't get hidden. And I keep the field mask layer locked as well, so I won't move it out of place accidentally. And of course you can turn this off and on when you need it in the layers panel, and same with the guides. Okay, so that concludes our tour of the layers in this file. Now that we've established a lot of the technical stuff, we can move on to the creative parts. We'll start the editing process with a couple of preference settings. So go ahead and set your keyboard increment to 1 inch, and this way we'll be able to nudge objects around precisely. Okay, and then make sure you have scale, strokes, and effects unchecked. And again, this is to keep us from accidentally scaling those transform effects as we scale objects on the auto repeat layer. So if you need the strokes in your design to scale along with the object, you can always come back here and check this box later. But when you do that, you just have to be careful that you don't leave the target selected on the auto repeat layer when you scale your objects, because you'll be telling Illustrator you want to resize the transform effects on the layer too, and that will mess up the spacing of the repeat. Okay, so I've moved my layers panel out closer to the artboard so we can see it better, and I have the background layer locked and visible. The auto repeat layer is visible and unlocked, and then all the other layers are locked. And right now my unit guides are visible and my field mask is turned off. And I'm working on the auto repeat layer. I'm starting out with just one element now in this layer just to keep things simple. And as you move an object around, notice how it interacts with the boundary of the repeating unit. If you move it to the left edge, you can see that same element appears in the same place on the right edge. And the edge of the repeat cuts through the element in exactly the same spot on the left as it does on the right. Move it to the top edge and notice the same thing. It crosses the boundary at the same point up here as it does down here. So, there are two real ground rules for a grid repeat, a basic repeat like this, to work successfully. First, opposite sides will be identical, so any element that appears on the left edge must also appear in the same spot on the right edge. And of course, the beauty of this setup is that it makes that happen automatically. The other ground rule is that the corners must be identical. So when I move this one flower into the top right corner, you can see, and especially when we look down here at the export unit, the 4 corners are all the same now. We talked about these ground rules in my Illustrator 2 class because they apply to any grid repeat you create, even pattern fill swatches. But it's really amazing how much easier it is to illustrate here since we have this updating instantly. One limitation, though, that's already visible here is that we're missing flowers down the left side of the field. So the flower in this case needs to be in the top left corner. And this is the same with elements on the top and left edges. If I move this flower, nudging 3 inches to the right, the overall design is incomplete and the left side of the field is empty. And same thing here. If you position the flower on the bottom edge, we won't see any design along the top edge. So as you work with this file, it's best to focus on keeping elements that cross the boundary of the repeat unit, keep them on the top and left rather than on the right or bottom sides of the working unit. So that way we won't lose any of the design along here. And this is precisely why I've set this file up with a working unit in the top corner and then an export unit here sort of more central, because the export unit is actually more foolproof. As you can see, even though the working unit is incomplete right now, the export unit is complete. It's showing the repeat correctly. So if you uploaded this square to Spoonflower, your pattern would work. But obviously, if your ultimate goal is more about the larger artboard, the 12 by 12 inch field, if you're printing off samples on your printer at home or you're exporting this as a background paper, then you really do have to focus on the top and left edges of the working unit to make sure that your pattern repeats completely. So anytime you're looking at your pattern and you notice an element missing along the top or left sides of the design, look to the opposite side, locate that element, select it, and nudge it to the top or left edge, and then problem solved. Another tip that will help you as you're working is to make copies of design elements by using the Option key or Alt key to drag out a copy rather than using the copy-paste command. When I do just a regular old Command-Control-C, Command or Control-V, the copy lands in the center of the window, and this can get confusing, especially when you have a packed design. So let me delete this, and instead I'll just drag copy holding Option or Alt as I drag. Or you can use copy paste in front. That works well too. Okay, and then when I have more elements in my working unit, it's helpful to check back in with outline mode. That's Command or Control Y, and that way you can remember where your paths are, because it's tempting to reach for these copies over here and try and move them around, but they're really just an effect, of course. So it's good to use Command or Control Y occasionally to remind yourself of where the real art is. And one more tip. As I'm spacing things out and trying to get the balance right, I'll create placeholder shapes, like a circle, and I'll even give it a color so I can really understand its contrast with everything surrounding it. And then I can fill in the space later with a design, but it helps me to work out the spacing temporarily just by creating a simple circle like this as a placeholder. So now spend a few minutes experimenting with the design. You can delete some of the elements here to simplify this just as you're getting acquainted with how this works. It's probably better to work more simply. And the originals are still up there on the scratchpad layer, so you can always get those back if you need them. And just play with one element or two, making copies, scale, move them around. And while you're doing this, keep in mind these tips we just discussed. Keep boundary crossing elements focused on the top and left edge of the working unit, and nudge them there if you need to. Make copies by Option-Alt dragging or use copy paste in front. Check outline mode occasionally to see where your paths are. And draw simple placeholder shapes as you work out the spacing of your design. Practice a bit with this, and then meet me in the next lesson and we'll keep going. Now we'll look at using the scratchpad layer and working back and forth between that and the auto repeat layer while we're editing the pattern. So right now my scratchpad layer is unlocked and I want to use this flower here. So I'm going to Option-Alt drag out a copy of it, dragging the copy down to the working unit. And right now it's still on the scratchpad layer, so it's not repeating. And to move it into the repeat, I'll go over to the Layers panel and move its selection indicator, just dragging it down to the auto repeat layer. Okay, so I've added this art to my pattern now, and while this element is repeating, there are a lot of edits I can make. I can copy it and move it, scale it. I could go in and change a color. And all of that is pretty easy and works pretty well. There will be times, though, when you need to isolate an element and take it apart or do more extensive edits. And that's a good time to use the scratchpad layer. And you can do that without moving off to the side. You can stay right here within the artboards. So let me make sure that I'm zoomed in close to the working unit and the flower I'm going to edit is selected. And I'll go back to the Layers panel and drag the indicator up to the scratchpad layer. And you can even lock the auto repeat layer so you won't disturb the design on that layer, or turn it off so you can focus exclusively on the element you're editing. And this extra space allows me to ungroup this element and take it apart. And I can get out the CS5 Shape Builder tool, or if you're in CS4, the Pathfinder, and merge things. Or really whatever. It's just nice sometimes to have a little more space to work with. And then once you're done, back in the Layers panel, you can turn the visibility of the Auto Repeat layer back on and unlock it. And with the element selected, you can just move it back into the Auto Repeat and lock the scratch pad if you need to, if you have other things that you're still working on there. And now I can go back to working on the spacing some more. So the main point here is to utilize the Layers panel. Work back and forth between the scratch pad layer and the Auto Repeat layer. Lock and unlock and turn visibility of those layers off and on. And that'll just help you focus on exactly what you're working on. And this is a big part of the functionality of setting up these template files this way. These two layers are really equally important in the editing process. And this is a good thing that if you just practice it a bit, you'll get the hang of it. And so here's another tip to help you with editing. As you're moving elements around, if you discover that it takes an extra second for things to render, or if it seems slow, that can happen if you have a complex pattern and you're using a lot of gradients or drop shadows, or if the transform effects are having to make more copies, like if the working unit was smaller than this, so there were more tiling out. All of those things can demand more processing power. So if this is happening to you, add the gradients and the drop shadows towards the end of the editing process, and that will allow you to work faster. So just bear that in mind as you add your own art to this template, and remember to take advantage of working between the scratch pad layer and the Auto Repeat layer as you edit the pattern. In this lesson, we'll talk about the overlap of elements, and this is another thing you'll need to pay attention to in the editing process, especially as your pattern unit gets more full and more complex. And this issue comes up even if you're in the new CS6 pattern maker. Even there, you still have to manage how objects overlap. And so here's what I mean. This flower with the dotted line is overlapping the green flower here, and I want it to be underneath the green flower. So I'll use the command send to back, and it doesn't seem to be working. If I look in the Layers panel and twirl down to look at the stacking order of objects on the Auto Repeat layer, that dotted line flower is definitely at the bottom of the stacking order. But the reason it doesn't appear that way in Repeat is because the green flower here, and I'm going to switch to outline mode, is just an effect. The editable green flower, the actual art, is over on the left boundary of the working unit. Okay, so in an earlier lesson we made a pact to keep elements over here on the left edge so we don't wind up with an incomplete repeat. So if I take the flower on the left, nudge it 3 inches to the right, the overlap problem is solved, but the left-hand edge is now missing some art. So in a case like this, I'm going to suggest that you do your editing work in stages. So you start out working with the general spacing relationships, the color relationships, and then work on finalizing the individual elements, editing them like we just did on the scratch pad layer. And then toward the end of the process, you can deal with overlap and the way elements interact with the unit boundaries. So if I was getting close to the last stages of this pattern before exporting, I'd look at this overlap here and see that it's working just as I want it to now, only I need that flower on the left edge too. And remember, even in this unfinished state, the export unit is fine, so nothing's stopping me from exporting this artboard, uploading it to Spoonflower, and previewing it on Yardage over there if I want. And it will work. But to take care of this hole on the left edge, I'm going to copy the green flower, paste in front, and nudge it 3 times to the left. This is why we set our keyboard increment in Preferences to 1 inch to make it easy to be exact. And we have a 3-inch repeat. Then I want to group these 2 flowers because if these get out of sync with each other, you can see what happens. So I'll undo that and group these 2 flowers so they move together. And then I can still do my fine tuning. Now I have to say, this won't solve all your overlap problems. That's one way of dealing with one situation. Another way of dealing with this is to fudge things a bit. For example, I want this big flower here to overlap my little green flowers. So I'll bring it to front. And it's on top of the stacking order now, but it only repeats correctly on the left side of my pattern field. And the reason is because of something I mentioned before. These transform effects, they repeat in an overlap fashion, so they work like roof shingles or fish scales. So moving from left to right, this tile overlaps this tile, and this overlaps this tile, and so on. Same thing as you move vertically. So to fudge this, you can even move elements outside the working unit. So I'll nudge the big flower to the right, 3 inches. And then copy, paste in front, and nudge the copy back to fill in the hole on the left like we did before. And again, I'll group them so I can move them together if I need to. Even this dotted line flower can be moved outside the working unit, just nudging it to the left 3 times. So it's clearly outside the boundary of the working unit now, but looking in the pattern field, it looks right. And now I'll switch to outline mode. We can see we've got flowers that are fully outside the working unit, but they look okay in preview. So there are numerous ways to make this work in a grid repeat. It gets more complex in a half drop repeat. But my main point here is that you can manipulate and copy elements and nudge things to make this work. And this is just part of the editing process to keep your eye on. So keep playing with this pattern, get acquainted with editing it, have fun with it, and in the next lesson, I want to take a break from working on the design for a moment and talk about how to use these artboards for printing tests and exporting images.